On what should have been the most intimate night of my life, my husband of 6 hours locked himself in the guest bedroom, claiming exhaustion. And at midnight, I followed the sound of careful footsteps down the hallway to discover him sitting on the edge of his mother's bed, his head resting on her lap while she stroked his hair and whispered, "It's all right, my darling boy. Mama's here now." In that single frozen moment, watching my 60-year-old groom being soothed like a frightened child by his 82-year-old mother, I understood that I had not married a man. I had married a son who would never truly leave his mother's side. My name is Carol Bennett, and I am 58 years old. For the past 35 years, I worked as a librarian at the Charlotte Public Library in North Carolina, surrounded by stories of triumph and tragedy, love and loss. Yet somehow, I never imagined my own story would become one of the most disturbing chapters I'd ever encountered. I thought I knew what I was getting into when I accepted Stephen's proposal last December, believing that companionship in our later years would be a comfort, a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. I was wrong in ways I couldn't have foreseen. Stephen and I met at a community book club in September 2023, both of us navigating the loneliness that often accompanies late middle age. He was a retired accountant, soft-spoken and thoughtful, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. We bonded over our love of classic literature and quiet evenings, and within months, what began as friendship blossomed into romance, or so I believed. He was attentive, bringing me flowers, taking me to dinner at modest but charming restaurants, and speaking of a future together that felt both comforting and exciting. There were signs, of course, warning signals I chose to ignore or rationalize away. Stephen lived with his mother Margaret in the sprawling colonial house where he'd grown up, a decision he explained as practical given her advanced age and his role as her primary caregiver since his father's death 15 years prior. "She needs me," he would say, whenever I suggested he might consider assisted living options for her or at least hiring professional help. "I'm all she has left." I admired his devotion initially, interpreting it as evidence of his character and loyalty. My own parents had passed years ago, and the idea of a man who honored his familial responsibilities seemed noble rather than troubling. But as our relationship deepened, I began noticing peculiarities that unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Stephen canceled dates frequently, always with the same explanation. Margaret wasn't feeling well, or she needed him for something urgent that somehow always arose precisely when we had plans. He never stayed overnight at my apartment, insisting he had to be home in case his mother needed him during the night. And whenever I visited their home, Margaret regarded me with thinly veiled hostility, her sharp blue eyes assessing me as though I were an intruder threatening her carefully constructed domain. "She's just protective," Stephen would say when I mentioned her coldness. "She'll warm up to you eventually. She's been through so much." Our engagement in December 2023 was quiet, almost subdued, with Stephen presenting me a modest diamond ring over dinner at a small Italian restaurant. When I suggested we tell Margaret together, his expression clouded briefly before he agreed. Her reaction was predictably icy, a tight smile, congratulations that sounded more like condolences, and a swift retreat to her bedroom claiming a sudden headache. Planning the wedding became an exercise in navigating Margaret's passive-aggressive interference. Every decision I made was subtly undermined. The venue wasn't suitable because it was too far for her to travel comfortably. The date conflicted with some vague family tradition I'd never heard of. My choice of flowers reminded her of a funeral. Stephen, caught between us, attempted to mediate but ultimately deferred to his mother's preferences more often than mine. A pattern I told myself would change once we were actually married. The wedding itself on June 15, 2024, was small and strained, held at a Presbyterian church in Charlotte with fewer than 30 guests. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed entirely in black, her expression suggesting she was attending a funeral rather than a celebration. I pushed aside my unease, focusing on the vows Stephen and I exchanged, the promises of partnership and devotion that I desperately wanted to believe were genuine. After the modest reception at a local restaurant, we returned to what was supposed to be our home, the colonial house I would now share with Stephen and, unfortunately, Margaret. Stephen had assured me we'd have privacy, that his mother's suite was on the opposite end of the house, and that we'd establish boundaries to protect our marriage. I clung to those promises as we walked through the front door that evening, newly married and supposedly beginning our life together. But within an hour, everything unraveled. Stephen became distant, distracted, glancing repeatedly toward the hallway that led to his mother's wing. When I suggested we retire to our bedroom, the master suite he'd recently redecorated for us, he hesitated, then claimed exhaustion from the day's events. "I'm too tired tonight, Carol," he said, avoiding my eyes. "The stress of the wedding, all the planning. I just need to rest. You understand, don't you?" Hurt and confused, I watched as he gathered his pajamas and retreated not to our bedroom, but to the guest room down the hall, the one adjacent to Margaret's suite. He kissed my forehead with perfunctory affection and closed the door firmly behind him, leaving me standing alone in the hallway of what was supposed to be our marital home, feeling more abandoned than I'd ever felt in my life. I went to our bedroom, my bedroom now, it seemed, and sat on the edge of the bed in my wedding dress, trying to process what had just happened. Surely there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps he truly was exhausted. Perhaps this was just an unfortunate start to what would become a normal marriage once we adjusted to living together. But at midnight, I heard it, the soft creak of the guest room door opening, followed by careful footsteps in the hallway. Curiosity overriding propriety, I slipped out of bed and peered around the doorframe. Stephen, dressed in pajamas, was walking quietly toward his mother's suite, glancing behind him as though checking for witnesses. My heart pounding, I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows as he knocked softly on Margaret's door. It opened immediately as though she'd been waiting, and he slipped inside. The door didn't close completely, leaving a narrow gap through which light spilled into the darkened hallway. I approached silently, every instinct screaming that I shouldn't look, that whatever was happening beyond that door would fundamentally alter everything. But I had to know. I had to understand what kind of marriage I'd entered. Through the gap, I saw them. Stephen sitting on the edge of his mother's ornate four-poster bed, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. Margaret, in an elaborate silk nightgown, sat beside him, one hand stroking his hair in slow, possessive movements, while the other gripped his hand tightly. "It's all right, my darling boy," she murmured in a voice thick with satisfaction. "Mama's here now. You don't have to pretend anymore. That woman doesn't understand you the way I do. She never will." Stephen didn't protest. Instead, he leaned into her touch like a child seeking comfort, his voice small and broken. "I tried, Mama. I really tried. But I can't do it. I can't be a husband. I just want things to be the way they were before." "And they will be," Margaret cooed, her expression triumphant as she continued stroking his hair. "We'll get rid of her, one way or another. She's just a phase. You belong here, with me, where you've always belonged." I stood frozen, my hand pressed against my mouth to stifle the gasp threatening to escape. This wasn't a mother comforting an adult son. This was something far more disturbing, a possessive, emotionally incestuous relationship that had apparently existed for years, perhaps decades, with Stephen trapped in a codependency so profound that he couldn't break free even on his wedding night. The marriage I thought I'd entered didn't exist. The partnership I'd imagined was a fiction. And the man I'd vowed to spend my life with was still, in every meaningful way, his mother's little boy. As I backed away from that door, my wedding dress rustling softly in the silence, I knew with absolute certainty that this couldn't stand. I would not spend the rest of my life competing with an 82-year-old woman for my own husband's attention, nor would I enable Stephen's inability to become an independent adult. The question wasn't whether this marriage could be saved. It was whether it had ever really begun. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of my 60-year-old husband seeking comfort in his elderly mother's arms, the possessive way she touched him, the disturbing intimacy of their midnight ritual. It replayed endlessly in my mind, like a horror film I couldn't turn off. As dawn broke over Charlotte, painting the guest bedroom where I'd retreated in shades of gray and gold, I realized that what I'd witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a glimpse into a decades-long pattern I'd been too naive or too desperate for companionship to recognize. I spent the early morning hours reviewing our entire courtship with fresh eyes, parsing through memories now tainted by suspicion. How many red flags had I dismissed? How many concerning behaviors had I rationalized as quirks or devotion rather than symptoms of something fundamentally broken? The first troubling memory surfaced from October 2023, barely a month into our relationship. Stephen and I had planned a weekend trip to Asheville to see the fall foliage, reservations made at a charming bed and breakfast. 2 days before departure, he called with apologetic reluctance in his voice, explaining that Margaret had developed a mysterious ailment, nothing specific, just not feeling herself, and he couldn't possibly leave her alone. When I offered to postpone rather than cancel, suggesting we could go the following weekend, he'd hesitated before admitting that Margaret's episodes were unpredictable and planning ahead was difficult. Maybe next time, he'd said, but next time never came. Every attempt to schedule overnight trips was sabotaged by Margaret's conveniently timed health crises or emotional needs. Then there was Thanksgiving 2023, when Stephen invited me to join them for dinner. I'd arrived with homemade pecan pie and optimism, hoping to bond with Margaret despite her obvious coolness toward me. But the entire meal was an exercise in calculated exclusion. Margaret and Stephen shared inside jokes I couldn't understand, referenced family memories with the kind of nostalgic intimacy that deliberately shut me out, and whenever I attempted to contribute to conversation, Margaret would pivot the topic back to something only she and Stephen shared. Most disturbing was the seating arrangement. Margaret sat at the head of the table with Stephen immediately to her right, the position typically reserved for a spouse. I was relegated to the far end, physically separated from the couple who seemed more married to each other than Stephen and I would ever be. Christmas had been worse. Stephen gave his mother an elaborate diamond bracelet that must have cost several $1,000s, while my gift was a modest book about gardening. Thoughtful enough, but the disparity spoke volumes about where his priorities lay. Margaret had opened her gift with tears of joy, throwing her arms around Stephen's neck and calling him my most precious gift, while I sat awkwardly on the sofa, wondering if I was witnessing a mother-son relationship or something far more psychologically complex. Now, in the harsh light of revelation, I understood these weren't isolated quirks, but symptoms of a codependent dynamic so entrenched that Stephen literally couldn't function as an autonomous adult. But I needed more than memories and gut feelings. I needed concrete evidence of just how deep this pathology ran. I waited until Stephen left for his morning walk with Margaret, a daily ritual I'd found charming until now, before beginning my investigation. Their house was large, filled with 40 years of accumulated possessions, and I started methodically searching for documents that might illuminate the financial dimensions of their relationship. In Stephen's home office, I found the filing cabinet unlocked, folders neatly labeled in his precise accountant's handwriting. Tax returns from the past decade revealed something startling. Stephen and Margaret filed jointly as head of household, with Margaret listed as his dependent. More concerning were the bank statements showing a joint checking account in both their names with Margaret as the primary account holder, despite Stephen providing all the income. Monthly expenditures painted a disturbing picture. Stephen paid for everything: Margaret's medication, her country club membership, her subscription to luxury fashion magazines, even her donations to various charities. His own expenses were modest by comparison, almost ascetic. It was as though he existed solely to fund his mother's lifestyle while denying himself any independent financial identity. I photographed documents with my phone, hands trembling with anger and disbelief. This wasn't just emotional codependency, it was financial enmeshment that would make disentangling our marriage, should it come to that, exponentially more complicated. My next call was to Sharon Mitchell, my closest friend from the library and the only person I trusted with the devastating truth of my situation. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from Stephen and Margaret's neighborhood, and I poured out the entire story: the locked guest room, the midnight scene, the financial revelations. Sharon listened with growing horror, but when I finished, Her expression shifted to something like recognition. "Carol, I hate to say this, but there were rumors years ago, before you moved to Charlotte, back when I first started at the library around 2005. "What kind of rumors?" I asked, dreading the answer. "About Stephen and his mother. People talked about how he never dated seriously after his father died, how Margaret seemed almost possessive. There was an incident at some community event where a woman showed interest in Stephen, and Margaret allegedly caused such a scene that the poor woman left in tears. After that, Stephen just stopped engaging socially altogether. It was like Margaret had successfully isolated him. The timeline aligned perfectly. Stephen's father had died in 2009, 15 years ago, and according to Sharon, Stephen's withdrawal from normal adult relationships had begun shortly thereafter. What should have been a period of grief and eventual healing had instead calcified into a twisted dependency that prevented Stephen from ever truly individuating from his mother. "Do you think they're—" Sharon trailed off delicately, unable to voice the darkest suspicion. "Physically inappropriate?" "I don't know," I admitted. "What I saw was disturbing enough without crossing that line. But emotionally, psychologically, it's absolutely incestuous. She treats him like a husband, and he responds like a devoted spouse. I'm the interloper in their marriage." Sharon reached across the table, gripping my hand firmly. "You need to get out, Carol. This isn't fixable. This isn't something counseling can repair, because neither of them sees anything wrong with it. Stephen chose this life a long time ago." I knew she was right, but the practical realities loomed large. We'd been married less than 24 hours. Divorce required grounds and time. But annulment, claiming the marriage was fraudulent from the start, that Stephen had concealed his inability to function as a husband, that might be faster. Over the next several days, I continued my investigation while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Stephen seemed relieved I wasn't pressing him about our non-existent wedding night, retreating into his routine of catering to Margaret's every whim while barely acknowledging my presence. It was as though the wedding had been a performance he'd endured, and now that it was over, he could return to the relationship that actually mattered to him. I documented everything. The nights Stephen spent in the guest room adjacent to Margaret's suite, rather than with me, the way Margaret summoned him with a small bell she kept on her nightstand, the infantilizing pet names she used. My precious boy, Mama's darling, my special one. I recorded phone conversations where Margaret manipulated Stephen with transparent emotional blackmail, claiming chest pains or dizziness whenever he showed the slightest inclination toward independence. Most damning was discovering Margaret's journal in her bedroom during one of her afternoon naps. I knew invading her privacy was ethically questionable, but my need for understanding outweighed propriety. The entries were chilling in their possessiveness. Stephen brought that woman home again today. She thinks she can take him from me, but she's wrong. He's mine, always has been, always will be. After his father died, I made sure Stephen understood where his loyalties must lie. No woman will ever come between us. Another entry from just after our engagement. The fool actually proposed to her. I'll allow this charade to continue for now, but she won't last. They never do. Stephen always comes back to me. He can't survive without his mama. The journal confirmed what I'd suspected. Margaret had actively sabotaged every relationship Stephen had attempted, using emotional manipulation and manufactured crises to ensure his continued dependence. And Stephen, whether from guilt, conditioning, or genuine inability to function independently, had surrendered his autonomy so completely that he couldn't even consummate his own marriage. Armed with evidence and sick with betrayal, I began planning my next move. This wasn't a marriage that could be saved through communication or compromise. This was a psychological prison, and I had two choices: accept my role as the third wheel in Stephen and Margaret's twisted dynamic, or fight for my dignity and freedom. I chose freedom. But extracting myself would require strategy, legal counsel, and the courage to confront truths that neither Stephen nor Margaret wanted acknowledged. The silent investigation phase was ending. The time for direct action was approaching, and I was ready. Armed with documentation of Stephen and Margaret's pathological relationship, I knew confrontation alone wouldn't suffice. I needed legal guidance, emotional support, and a clear exit strategy that would protect both my dignity and my assets. The morning after discovering Margaret's damning journal entries, I scheduled an appointment with Patricia Thompson, a family law attorney whose reputation for handling complex annulment cases was well established in Charlotte's legal community. Patricia's office occupied the third floor of a renovated brownstone in Uptown, her walls lined with law degrees and certificates that spoke to decades of experience. When I entered that Tuesday afternoon, she greeted me with the kind of compassionate professionalism that immediately put me at ease. I'd brought copies of everything: bank statements, Margaret's journal excerpts, photographs of the guest room where Stephen spent his nights, and a timeline documenting his pattern of choosing his mother over me. "Mrs. Bennet," Patricia began after reviewing my materials, "what you're describing falls under what we call fraudulent inducement to marry. Your husband concealed his inability and unwillingness to fulfill the basic obligations of marriage. More significantly, he entered this union knowing he couldn't separate from his mother emotionally, financially, or practically. Can we pursue annulment rather than divorce?" I asked, the distinction mattering enormously to me. Divorce implied a marriage that had existed and failed. Annulment would declare it had never truly been valid. Absolutely. North Carolina recognizes several grounds for annulment, including fraud and non-consummation. The fact that your marriage hasn't been consummated after a week, combined with evidence of Stephen's deception about his ability to function as a spouse, gives us strong footing. We'll need to file quickly. Annulments become more difficult the longer you wait. Relief washed through me. How quickly? We can file within days. But before we do, I recommend securing your financial interests. Do you have separate accounts, or did you merge finances with Stephen? Separate, thankfully. I kept my retirement funds and savings independent. We opened a joint household account with minimal deposits, but nothing substantial. Patricia nodded approvingly. Smart. That simplifies things considerably. However, I'm concerned about your living situation. You're currently residing in a home owned by Stephen and his mother, which puts you in a vulnerable position should things turn hostile. The thought of remaining under Margaret's roof, subjected to her triumphant smirks and Stephen's cowardly avoidance, was unbearable. I can stay with my friend Sharon temporarily. I just need to retrieve my belongings without triggering a confrontation before we're legally prepared. Coordinate that carefully, Patricia advised. I'll draft the annulment petition today. Once filed, we'll serve Stephen with papers. I recommend having a witness present when you inform him, both for your protection and to document his response. Given the psychological dynamics you've described, his mother will likely interfere aggressively. That afternoon, I met with Father David Williams, the pastor who'd officiated our wedding just days earlier. His small office at Charlotte Presbyterian smelled of old books and lemon polish, the walls decorated with religious art and photographs from decades of ministry. Father Williams had known Stephen peripherally through community events, but admitted he'd never counseled him extensively before agreeing to perform the ceremony. "Carol, I'm deeply troubled by what you've shared," he said after I explained the situation. During our brief premarital meeting, Stephen seemed nervous, but attributed it to typical wedding jitters. I asked specifically if there were any impediments to the marriage, any reservations or concerns, and he assured me there weren't. If I'd known about this level of attachment to his mother, I would have insisted on extensive counseling before proceeding. "Did you notice anything unusual about Margaret during the ceremony?" I asked, remembering her funeral attire and hostile demeanor. Father Williams paused thoughtfully. She seemed proprietary. That's the word that comes to mind. The way she watched Stephen during the vows, it was almost like she was the one making promises to him, not you. At the time, I dismissed it as a mother's natural emotion at her son's wedding, but in light of what you've described, it takes on a more sinister dimension. Would you be willing to provide a statement to my attorney about what you observed and Stephen's failure to disclose his situation during premarital consultation? Absolutely. This isn't just about legal proceedings, Carol. It's about accountability. Stephen and his mother have created a dynamic that prevents authentic intimacy and honest relationships. That's spiritually unhealthy as well as psychologically damaging. Leaving Father Williams's office, I felt validated in ways I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't my failure or my inadequacy. This was a systemic dysfunction that had existed long before I entered Stephen's life. Sharon helped me strategize the logistics of moving out. We planned for a Thursday afternoon when Stephen typically accompanied Margaret to her weekly hair appointment, a 2-hour ritual that gave me a window to pack essentials and vacate the premises. Sharon enlisted 2 other friends from the library, creating a small but efficient moving team that could clear my belongings quickly. "You're not just leaving a bad marriage," Sharon told me as we organized boxes in her garage. "You're escaping something toxic that would have slowly destroyed you." Margaret has spent 15 years grooming Stephen into the perfect companion son, and she wasn't about to relinquish control. The psychological terminology helped frame what I'd experienced. Emotional incest, that's what therapists called relationships where a parent treated an adult child as a surrogate spouse, meeting emotional needs inappropriately while preventing that child from forming healthy partnerships. Stephen wasn't just a dutiful son, he was trapped in a role Margaret had carefully constructed after her husband's death, and he lacked either the insight or the courage to break free. Wednesday evening, I approached Stephen in his office, my tone calm but resolute. "We need to talk about our marriage." He looked up from his computer, anxiety flickering across his features. "Carol, I know things haven't been ideal." "They haven't been anything," I interrupted gently. "Stephen, we've been married for over a week, and you haven't spent a single night in our bedroom. You retreat to your mother every evening. You prioritize her needs above any possibility of building a life with me. This isn't a marriage. It's a charade." His face crumpled. "I tried, Carol. I really did. I thought if I just committed, if I went through with the wedding, I could change. But I can't. Mother needs me, and I can't abandon her. Your mother is 82 years old and in excellent health. She doesn't need constant attendance. She wants it. There's a difference. And you're enabling her control because it's easier than establishing adult boundaries." "You don't understand our relationship," he protested weakly. "After Dad died, I promised I'd take care of her. I can't break that promise. Taking care of her doesn't mean sacrificing your own life, Stephen. It doesn't mean refusing to build a marriage or maintain your own identity. You've allowed yourself to become her emotional husband, and that's not healthy for either of you." He had no response, just hung his head in the defeated posture of someone who recognized truth but couldn't act on it. "I'm filing for annulment," I said quietly. "You'll be served with papers shortly. I'm moving out tomorrow. This marriage never really began, and it can't continue." Stephen didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded, relief evident beneath the surface guilt. Perhaps on some level, he was grateful I was making the decision he couldn't make himself. That night, I packed methodically. Clothing, books, personal items accumulated during my brief tenure as Mrs. Bennet. Margaret's bell rang twice, summoning Stephen, and both times he went obediently, leaving me to my preparations. The house felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of normal family life that had never materialized. Thursday afternoon, while Stephen chauffeured Margaret to her salon appointment, Sharon and our friends arrived with a rental van. We worked efficiently, clearing my possessions in under 90 minutes. I left the wedding gifts behind. None of them held meaning now, and took only what was legitimately mine. On the kitchen table, I placed a folder containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, along with a note. "Stephen, these documents tell the story of a relationship that was never going to work. I hope someday you find the courage to seek help and build a life beyond your mother's shadow. But that journey isn't mine to take with you. Carol." As we drove away from that colonial house for the final time, I felt the weight of failed dreams, but also the lightness of liberation. Some mistakes can be corrected quickly if you're willing to acknowledge them honestly. I was 58 years old, briefly married, and already planning my annulment. But I was also free, dignified, and resolved never again to ignore warning signs in pursuit of companionship. The confrontation would come. The legal proceedings would unfold. But the hardest part, the decision to leave, was behind me, and I was ready for whatever came next. The annulment papers arrived at Stephen's house via certified mail on Monday morning, exactly 10 days after our wedding. Patricia had counseled me to let the legal process serve as the initial confrontation, allowing Stephen time to absorb the reality before any face-to-face meeting. But I knew from experience that Margaret would intercept the documents, manufacture some crisis, and prevent Stephen from processing the situation honestly. So I scheduled what I framed as a mediation meeting at Father Williams's church office for that Wednesday afternoon, requesting both Stephen and Margaret attend. Stephen agreed immediately, his voice on the phone carrying notes of resignation and perhaps relief. Margaret, however, required significant persuasion. "I don't see why I need to be present for your marital difficulties," she said coldly when Stephen relayed the invitation. "This is between you and my son." "Actually, Mrs. Bennet," I replied, having anticipated this resistance, "your presence is essential because you're central to the issues we need to address. Father Williams has requested you attend as well for spiritual guidance and family reconciliation." The invocation of pastoral authority seemed to corner her. Refusing would appear unreasonable, especially to Stephen, who still maintained nominal respect for religious convention. She agreed with audible reluctance. Sharon accompanied me to the church that Wednesday, her presence both moral support and witness to whatever unfolded. We arrived early, sitting in Father Williams's modest office while he reviewed the approach we'd outlined. The goal wasn't public humiliation, but honest confrontation, forcing Stephen and Margaret to acknowledge the dysfunction they'd normalized and presenting a clear ultimatum. "Remember," Patricia had coached me during our preparation, "you're not here to change them or save the relationship. You're here to establish record of your attempts at resolution before the annulment proceeds. Stay calm, present facts, and don't get drawn into emotional manipulation." Stephen and Margaret arrived precisely on time, Margaret's expression glacial as she surveyed the assembled group. She wore a tailored navy suit that projected authority, her silver hair styled immaculately, every inch the matriarch defending her territory. Stephen looked haggard, his eyes darting between his mother and me with palpable anxiety. Father Williams opened with prayer, his words emphasizing honesty, courage, and the sacred nature of marital vows, a pointed reminder of what Stephen had violated. Then he invited me to speak. I began with measured calm, outlining the events of our wedding night without melodrama. Stephen locked himself in the guest room, claiming exhaustion. At midnight, I followed sounds down the hallway and witnessed him seeking comfort from his mother in a manner that was emotionally inappropriate for a married man. He sat on her bed, his head in her lap, while she stroked his hair and assured him he didn't have to pretend to be a husband, that he belonged with her. Margaret's face flushed crimson. "How dare you spy on a private moment between a mother and her son? Stephen was overwhelmed by the wedding, and I was simply providing maternal comfort. Maternal comfort doesn't include telling your adult son that his wife doesn't understand him the way you do, or promising to get rid of her," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Those were your exact words, Mrs. Bennet. I heard them clearly." Stephen's head dropped, shame radiating from his posture. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Father Williams raised a hand. "Please allow Carol to finish." I continued, presenting evidence methodically. "Over the past week, I've discovered that Stephen and Margaret maintain joint finances with her as primary account holder, despite him funding everything. Stephen files taxes listing his mother as a dependent in a head-of-household arrangement typically reserved for minor children or incapacitated adults. He spends every night in the guest room adjacent to her suite, responding to a bell she rings whenever she wants his attention. And most disturbingly, I found Mrs. Bennet's journal documenting years of deliberately sabotaging Stephen's relationships to maintain his dependence on her. I placed photocopies of journal entries on the desk, watching Margaret's composure fracture. "These are your words, Mrs. Bennet. He's mine, always has been, always will be. No woman will ever come between us. This isn't maternal devotion. This is possessive control that prevents your son from living as an autonomous adult." "You violated my privacy," Margaret sputtered, her voice shrill. "You had no right to read my personal journals." And you had no right to manipulate your son into a pseudo-marital relationship that makes real marriage impossible, I countered. Stephen, look at me. He raised his eyes reluctantly, tears brimming. I'm sorry, Carol. I truly am. I thought I could do it. Thought I could be a normal husband. But Mother needs me, and I can't. Your mother doesn't need you, Stephen. She wants total control over you, and you've surrendered it because it's easier than establishing boundaries. When did this start? After your father died? The question hung heavy. Stephen nodded slowly. After Dad's funeral, Mother fell apart. She couldn't sleep alone, couldn't manage the house, couldn't function. I moved back temporarily to help, and it just never ended. She'd have panic attacks when I tried to leave. She'd call me at midnight crying about hearing intruders or feeling chest pains. The doctors found nothing wrong, but I couldn't risk ignoring her. And over time, it became normal. Taking care of her, being her companion, structuring my whole life around her schedule. That's called enmeshment, Stephen, Father Williams said gently. It's a form of emotional dysfunction where boundaries between family members become so blurred that individual identity is lost. Your mother, consciously or unconsciously, has positioned you as a surrogate spouse to meet needs your father once fulfilled. And you've accepted that role at tremendous cost to your own development. Margaret stood abruptly. This is outrageous. I won't sit here and be pathologized for loving my son. Stephen chose to care for me because he's a good man with strong family values, unlike this woman who abandons marriage at the first difficulty. I'm not abandoning marriage, I said coldly. I'm acknowledging it never existed. Stephen cannot function as a husband while serving as your emotional spouse. That's the reality we're addressing. Sharon spoke for the first time, her voice steady. Mrs. Bennett, I've known about your relationship with Stephen for years. People in this community have talked about it for a long time. How you isolated him after your husband died. How you sabotaged every woman who showed interest. How Stephen gradually withdrew from all normal social engagement. This isn't new, and Carol isn't making it up. The validation from an outside source seemed to crack something in Stephen. He turned to his mother, his voice breaking. Is that true, Mother? Did you deliberately push women away? Did you manipulate situations to keep me dependent? Margaret's expression cycled through denial, defiance, and finally a kind of desperate justification. I protected you. Those women weren't suitable. They would have taken you away from family, from responsibility. You're all I have left, Stephen. Is it so wrong that I wanted to keep my son close? It's wrong when it prevents him from having his own life, I said. Stephen, you have a choice. You can continue this arrangement with your mother, accepting that you'll never have a genuine partnership with another person. Or you can pursue intensive therapy to establish healthy boundaries, learn to individuate, and potentially salvage some possibility of normal relationships. But you cannot do both. You cannot serve as your mother's surrogate husband while claiming to be mine. The ultimatum settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Stephen looked between Margaret and me, the conflict written across his features. Margaret's face hardened into defensive rage, but beneath it I saw fear. The fear of losing the control she'd maintained for 15 years. I choose Mother, Stephen whispered finally. I can't abandon her, Carol. I'm sorry, but I can't. The words, though expected, still carried a sting, but they also brought clarity. Then we're done here. Patricia will proceed with the annulment petition. You won't contest it, correct? Stephen shook his head. No, I won't fight it. You deserve better than what I can give. Margaret's triumph was palpable despite her attempts to mask it. She'd won, as she always did, and Stephen would return to their carefully maintained dysfunction. But I'd won something more valuable. My freedom, my dignity, and confirmation that leaving was the only sane choice. As we left Father Williams's office, Sharon squeezed my hand. You did everything right, Carol. You gave him a chance to choose differently. He chose her, I said simply. He always was going to. The annulment proceedings would move forward uncontested. Within weeks, the marriage that never truly began would be legally erased. And I would rebuild my life wiser and more discerning about the warning signs I'd once ignored. Stephen and Margaret could have each other. I wanted no part of their twisted arrangement. I was free. The annulment petition moved through the Mecklenburg County court system with surprising efficiency. North Carolina law recognizes fraud as valid grounds for voiding a marriage, and Stephen's documented inability to consummate our union, combined with evidence of his concealed emotional incapacity, provided an airtight case. Patricia filed the necessary paperwork in late June 2024, and by early August, we had a court date scheduled. Stephen, true to his word during our church meeting, didn't contest the proceedings. His attorney, a junior associate from a small firm who seemed embarrassed by the entire situation, filed a simple acknowledgement of service and consent to annulment. No counter-arguments, no attempts to negotiate terms, no defense of Stephen's behavior. It was as though he, too, recognized the marriage had been fraudulent from inception. Margaret, predictably, attempted interference despite having no legal standing in the matter. She called my phone repeatedly during the first week after I moved out, leaving voicemails that alternated between hostile accusations and manipulative appeals to my Christian charity. "You're destroying my son's reputation over a simple misunderstanding," one message claimed. "Stephen was merely exhausted on your wedding night. Every marriage has adjustments. You're being cruel and vindictive, and the community will see you for what you are, a bitter woman who couldn't handle the responsibilities of caring for an aging mother-in-law." I saved every voicemail, forwarding them to Patricia as documentation of harassment. After the fifth call, Patricia sent Margaret's attorney a cease and desist letter, and the calls stopped. But Margaret's campaign continued through other channels. She apparently reached out to members of our church congregation, spinning a narrative in which I was the unstable aggressor who'd abandoned poor Stephen without cause. Several acquaintances approached me at Sunday services with concerned questions or awkward sympathy, clearly having heard Margaret's version of events. I responded with dignified brevity. The marriage is being annulled due to issues that existed before the wedding and couldn't be resolved. I appreciate your concern, but won't be discussing details publicly. Father Williams, to his credit, addressed the gossip directly during a sermon about bearing false witness and the spiritual damage caused by spreading unverified stories. He didn't name Margaret explicitly, but his pointed remarks about parents who prevent their adult children from forming healthy partnerships made his position clear. Several congregation members approached me afterward with genuine support, sharing their own observations about Stephen and Margaret's unusual dynamic over the years. "I always wondered why he never dated seriously," one woman in her 70s confided. "Now it makes sense. His mother never would have allowed it." The court hearing itself was brief and procedural. Judge Catherine Reynolds, no relation to any of the story's other characters, reviewed the evidence, asked Stephen directly if he contested the annulment, and received his quiet confirmation that he did not. She examined the documentation of non-consummation, the financial enmeshment records, and Margaret's journal excerpts that Patricia had submitted as exhibits. "Mr. Bennett," Judge Reynolds said with barely concealed disapproval, "you entered this marriage knowing you couldn't fulfill its basic obligations. That constitutes fraud. Mrs. Carol Bennett is entitled to have this union voided as though it never occurred." Stephen nodded mutely, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the courtroom. Margaret sat rigidly in the gallery, her expression a mask of controlled fury. When the judge's gavel fell, declaring the marriage null and void, Margaret's hand shot out to grip Stephen's arm possessively, a gesture so blatant in its symbolism that even the court clerk noticed, her eyebrows rising. Outside the courthouse, I expected relief, but instead felt a profound sadness. Not for the loss of Stephen, I'd stopped mourning that possibility weeks ago, but for the waste of a life. Stephen was 60 years old, potentially with decades ahead, yet he'd chosen to spend them trapped in a dysfunctional arrangement that prevented growth, intimacy, or authentic connection. Margaret had successfully destroyed her son's capacity for independent life, and he'd been too weak or too damaged to resist. Sharon met me on the courthouse steps, pulling me into a fierce hug. "It's over. You're free. How do you feel?" "Sad," I admitted. "And grateful it happened quickly. before I invested years trying to fix something that was never going to work. The practical aftermath was surprisingly simple. We'd never merged significant assets, so there was no property to divide. I'd removed my belongings from the house. The few joint accounts we'd opened were closed, and funds returned to our individual names. Stephen offered no resistance to any of it, signing whatever documents Patricia presented with mechanical compliance. I heard through community channels that Margaret had essentially won. Stephen resumed his role as her full-time companion and caregiver, their routines returning to the patterns established over 15 years. But I also heard something else. Stephen had begun seeing a therapist, though whether at his own initiative or under pressure from Father Williams remained unclear. Part of me hoped therapy might help him recognize the damage he'd sustained and develop the courage to establish boundaries. But a larger, more realistic part understood that change at 60, after decades of conditioning, was monumentally difficult. Margaret would resist any therapeutic progress with every manipulation at her disposal, and Stephen lacked the strength to withstand her. In September, 2 months after the annulment, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Patricia's office. Stephen had written to apologize formally, acknowledging the pain he'd caused and the deception he'd perpetrated. I convinced myself that getting married would force me to change, that the commitment would somehow break the patterns I knew were unhealthy, he wrote in careful script. But I wasn't honest with you about the extent of my limitations, and that was unforgivable. You deserved a partner who could actually be present in the marriage, and I couldn't be that person. I'm sorry for wasting your time and breaking your trust. I hope you find happiness with someone capable of reciprocating your affection properly. I'm working with a therapist to understand why I've allowed this situation to continue, but I recognize that's too little, too late for us. I wish you well. Stephen. The letter was sincere, but also final, an acknowledgement without any request for forgiveness or suggestion of reconciliation. I appreciated that. Stephen was taking responsibility, however belatedly, and not asking me to absolve him or maintain contact. I wrote a brief reply. Thank you for your honesty. I hope therapy helps you find peace and autonomy. Take care of yourself. Carol. That exchange marked the true end of our connection. No dramatic confrontations, no ongoing bitterness, just two people acknowledging a mistake and moving forward separately. My own healing progressed through practical steps. I'd moved from Sharon's guest room into a small apartment near the library, a cozy one-bedroom with large windows and space that was entirely mine. I resumed volunteering, reconnected with friends I'd somewhat neglected during the whirlwind courtship and marriage, and gradually rebuilt the life I'd briefly set aside. The emotional recovery was more complex. I grieved not Stephen specifically, but the dream of companionship, the hope that late-life romance could provide comfort and partnership. That dream had been shattered by the reality of Stephen's dysfunction, leaving me cautious about future relationships and more attuned to warning signs I'd previously ignored. But I also discovered unexpected strength. I'd recognized a toxic situation quickly, acted decisively to extract myself, and refused to accept blame for failures that weren't mine. That resilience, forged through a painful experience, became a source of quiet pride. By October, 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, I found myself in a place of genuine peace. The annulment was complete, my life was my own, and the future, while uncertain, held possibility rather than dread. I was Carol Bennett again, not defined by a failed marriage but by the courage to walk away when staying would have destroyed me. And that, ultimately, was victory enough. December arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that makes Charlotte beautiful. Blue skies stretching endlessly, bare tree branches etched against winter light, the promise of holidays without the burden of pretense. I stood in my apartment on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, watching neighbors go about their weekend routines, and realized with quiet satisfaction that I'd reached a place I hadn't thought possible 6 months ago. Genuine contentment with solitude. The journey from that devastating wedding night to this moment of peace hadn't been linear or easy. There were nights when loneliness pressed heavy, when I questioned whether I'd given up too quickly, whether I should have tried harder to make Stephen choose differently. But those doubts always dissolved in the harsh light of reality. You cannot save someone who doesn't want saving, and you cannot compete with a pathology decades in the making. What I'd witnessed in Margaret and Stephen's relationship was a cautionary tale about the damage wrought when normal developmental boundaries are violated. After a spouse dies, grief is natural and support from adult children appropriate. But Margaret had crossed into something far more sinister. She'd deliberately cultivated Stephen's dependence, sabotaged his attempts at independence, and positioned herself as the central emotional relationship in his life to the exclusion of all others. And Stephen, whether from guilt, conditioning, or genuine psychological damage, had surrendered his autonomy so completely that he literally couldn't function as a husband, even for a single night. I'd done considerable reading in the months since the annulment, trying to understand what I'd encountered. Terms like emotional incest, covert incest, and enmeshment appeared repeatedly in psychological literature describing parent-child relationships where boundaries become dangerously blurred. Children raised in such environments often struggle with intimacy, have difficulty establishing independent identities, and experience profound guilt when attempting to separate from the enmeshed parent. Stephen fit the profile perfectly. His father's death when Stephen was 45 had apparently triggered Margaret's transformation from normal mother to possessive pseudo-spouse. Over 15 years, she'd systematically dismantled Stephen's capacity for autonomous adult life, and he'd internalized the role so deeply that even marriage, supposedly the ultimate commitment to another person, couldn't dislodge it. Understanding the psychology helped me release lingering guilt about not trying harder. This wasn't a problem I could have solved through patience or compromise. Stephen needed years of intensive therapy to even recognize the dysfunction, let alone address it. And Margaret would fight any therapeutic progress with every manipulation available, making recovery unlikely unless Stephen found courage I'd seen no evidence he possessed. The broader lesson I'd learned was about vigilance in relationships, especially later in life when loneliness can cloud judgment. I'd ignored warning signs because I wanted companionship, convinced myself that devotion to an aging parent was admirable rather than examining whether that devotion had crossed into unhealthy territory. I'd rationalized canceled dates, accepted excuses, and overlooked Margaret's hostility because confronting those red flags would have meant acknowledging the relationship was fundamentally flawed. Future relationships, if I pursued them, would be approached with greater discernment. Questions I should have asked Stephen early on now seemed obvious. How do you envision your life changing after marriage? What boundaries exist between you and your family of origin? Are you emotionally available for genuine partnership? Or are you seeking a wife to fulfill social expectations while maintaining primary loyalty elsewhere? Those conversations feel uncomfortable because they expose potential incompatibilities, but discomfort is preferable to discovering fundamental problems after legal commitment. My friendship with Sharon deepened through this experience, her steadfast support reminding me that romantic partnership isn't the only meaningful relationship in life. We'd begun hosting monthly dinners for single and widowed women from our church and library communities, creating space for honest conversation about the challenges of navigating dating, loneliness, and social expectations in our later years. Several women shared stories eerily similar to mine, relationships that seemed promising until family dynamics revealed themselves as insurmountable obstacles. The hardest part, one woman confided during an October gathering, is accepting that some people simply aren't available for partnership, no matter how much they might want to be. Their emotional energy is already committed elsewhere. That observation captured my situation precisely. Stephen wasn't a villain. He was a damaged man trapped in a relationship that prevented growth. Margaret wasn't purely evil. She was a widow who'd coped with loss by ensuring she'd never be alone again, regardless of the cost to her son's development. Neither had set out to harm me deliberately. I'd simply wandered into a dysfunction that had no space for healthy marriage. Professionally, I'd returned to volunteering at the library, finding purpose in connecting readers with books and helping patrons navigate information resources. The work felt meaningful in ways my brief marriage never had, reminding me that fulfillment comes from many sources beyond romantic partnership. I'd also begun writing personal essays about relationships, boundaries, and the particular challenges facing women seeking companionship later in life. Several pieces were published in local magazines and online journals, generating responses from readers who'd experienced similar situations. One woman wrote, describing her 20-year marriage to a man who'd never emotionally separated from his mother, the constant triangulation and competition that had slowly eroded her sense of self. "I wish I'd had your courage to leave early," she wrote. "I stayed, thinking love could fix it, and wasted 2 decades. Her message reinforced what I already knew. Leaving Stephen had been the right choice, perhaps the only sane choice. Some situations cannot be fixed through effort or commitment. Sometimes the healthiest response is recognizing impossibility and choosing self-preservation. In late November, I heard through church channels that Margaret had suffered a mild stroke, requiring hospitalization and temporary rehabilitation. Stephen, predictably, had devoted himself entirely to her care, essentially moving into the rehab facility to be available around the clock. Part of me felt sympathy. No one deserves illness. But a larger part recognized that Margaret's health crisis would only deepen Stephen's sense of obligation and guilt, making therapeutic progress even more unlikely. I sent a brief card expressing hopes for her recovery, signed simply Carol, with no return address. It was the appropriate gesture without reopening connection. Father Williams invited me to speak at a church seminar on healthy family relationships in early December, asking me to share lessons from my experience without revealing identifying details. Standing before a small audience of church members, I spoke honestly about warning signs, the difference between devotion and enmeshment, and the importance of establishing boundaries before legal commitment. "Love isn't enough to sustain marriage," I said, articulating a truth that contradicts romantic mythology. Partnership requires emotional availability, the capacity for intimacy, and willingness to prioritize the marital relationship appropriately. When those elements are absent, when one partner remains fundamentally committed to someone else, no amount of patience or compromise will create a functional marriage. The audience nodded, several people approaching afterward to share their own stories of relationships damaged by unhealthy family dynamics. As Christmas approached, I decorated my small apartment with care, creating traditions that belonged to me alone rather than compromising with someone else's preferences or managing someone else's family obligations. I hosted Sharon and several friends for a casual dinner, the conversation flowing easily without tension or hidden agendas. On Christmas Eve, attending midnight service at Charlotte Presbyterian, I found myself genuinely grateful, not despite the failed marriage, but in some ways because of it. The experience had taught me things about myself I needed to know: my capacity for decisive action when necessary, my unwillingness to accept relationships that diminish rather than enrich, and my ability to rebuild after disappointment. I was 58 years old, single again, and facing an uncertain future. But uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to honor my boundaries, and to choose dignity over desperation. Stephen and Margaret could continue their dysfunctional dance without me. I'd stepped out of that toxic pattern and reclaimed my life. Some stories don't have fairy tale endings. Some marriages fail not because of infidelity or cruelty, but because fundamental incompatibilities make partnership impossible. That's not failure on anyone's part. It's simply reality. And accepting reality, even when painful, is the foundation of wisdom. As I drove home from Christmas Eve service, Charlotte's streets twinkling with holiday lights, I whispered a prayer of gratitude. For escape, for clarity, for the courage to walk away when staying would have slowly destroyed me. I was Carol Bennett, librarian, friend, writer, and survivor of a marriage that never truly began. And I was, finally and completely, enough.